Today we're talking about some changes regarding the last patch. Heartseeker was buffed and it was requested that I make a video comparing it to other early game damage items, and that's exactly what we're gonna do. Now first, a little disclaimer. At the moment the meta is not necessarily favoring early raw damage items on every character, and it's also not necessarily favoring assassins in the jungle. So if you're looking at this from a jungler's perspective, which is what is mostly important for, then we have to keep in mind that especially warriors are very strong in the jungle at the moment and may warrant other item pickups. We have stuff like Gladiator's Shield being used, we have something like Shifters being taken into consideration, and some other options for the warriors themselves that don't really match with these items, but for the sake of comparison here, I'm simply gonna pick damage items that don't have any hybrid function, any defense to them, simply because I want to see how much damage potential there is in these different items if you're specifically looking for the highest damage. In that context, it's also important to look at what has been changed. In the case of Heartseeker, this is a price reduction by 100 gold to 2300 gold, as well as a power increase from 25 to 30. Heartseeker, when it was brought into its current state with the current passive, was originally a very highly valued item. It was very strong because it had so much damaging potential behind it, and then it got kind of nerfed and fell out of the meta and was barely picked up in comparison, which is why it saw a little bit of a buff. Nothing crazy, but a little bit of a buff. And that may just be enough to push it back into the meta when we're looking at damage items, excluding all the factors at the moment that may lead to you not picking up raw damage items over hybrid items. For this comparison, I used ZiSotto on level 10 against an Odin bot, just because you want to see how much damage you can deal early on against Squishy. This is what these items are mostly relevant for and what you're building them for. In the beginning, no one has too much physical protection, so the values kind of apply for almost everyone except those who rush a physical defense item. I chose ZiSotto here because he has 3 damaging abilities outside of his ultimate, making those relatively easy to apply in succession. We also have his passive, which gives him a little more extra damage and also triggers Bluestone once more. I excluded that here just for the sake of simplicity and because it makes it a little more comparable to other assassins, which may not have as much damage between their abilities. I want to get more of an idea of the average damage between those items here. So as the base, we have a level 10 ZiSotto. There's 1 maxed out, 1 point in the 2 and 2 points in the 3. The rest of the points would be in the ultimate, with Bluestone, Pendant, Warrior Tabi, and then the damaging item of your choice. The choices here are Jotunn's Wrath, Heartseeker, Brawler's Beatstick, and Hydra's Lament. First, we look at the price difference. The cheapest item is Hydra's Lament with 2150 gold. For only 50 gold more, you get Brawler's Beatstick, so the difference here is very insignificant. Heartseeker is another 100 gold on top of that, which makes a bit more of a difference already. Then Jotunn's Wrath is 2450 gold, so another 150 on top of that. That means that the price difference between Hydra's Lament and Jotunn's Wrath is already 300 gold, so this is something that shouldn't be undervalued. You will get one item significantly later than the other, and that's part of the reason why Jotunn's Wrath has kinda fallen out of favor compared to the others. It's just a bit too expensive next to the other items. But can Heartseeker actually compete now? For that, we need to look into the damage values. As always, this is just one of many theoretical examples, scenarios that could work, but it gives you a decent overview of something that could frequently happen in a match, and that is, I think, the important point because it gives you a better insight in a more realistic scenario. So what I assumed as a scenario here is landing your 3, your 2, and your 1 with all its swings, plus 2 basic attacks. Obviously, the number of 2 basics for ZiSotto is relatively low, as you can attack cancel more between the swings of his 1, but it's all a bit relative, and especially considering that many other gods aren't able to attack cancel as effectively, I felt like this was a reasonable number. I could have done the same thing with 3 hits or 4 hits and it wouldn't have changed all too much about the result anyways, because the only item that it makes significant differences for is Hydra's Lament, and then you also need to have the Hydra's Lament activation at the right time for it to happen, and even then the difference isn't crazy, so we'll look into that towards the end, but I can tell you that it doesn't make a massive difference. On top of that, I assumed 3 bluestone procs, 1 for every ability. I know that through the passive you can get an extra 1, but we're intentionally ignoring that here because it's just a very outlier-ish case for Susanoo. In the case of Heartseeker, we assume 1 passive stack, because you're not gonna get 5 swings in between, otherwise I'd have to calculate with 5 basic attacks anyways. And in the case of Hydras, we just assume that both of the hits get the Hydra's Lament passive on top of it. That brings us to the sums. And the sums are quite interesting. The highest value does not go to Heartseeker or Jotuns or Hydras, but to Brawlers, the anti-heal item. This isn't all too surprising when you think about it. It has the highest power and the highest penetration. So in terms of raw damage, it just has the most. On top of that, obviously, there's a nice passive added to it. Brawlers comes in at 1181 damage for the combo and is trailed by Heartseeker pretty much. Heartseeker has 1162 damage, so only 19 damage less, a very small difference here, assuming you get that 1 passive proc off. This already shows us that even if you are looking for the highest damage, then Heartseeker is not the ideal choice early on, especially considering there's also the more expensive option. In third place, we have Jotunn's Wrath with 1131 damage, so another 31 damage less or another 50 damage less than Brawlers. That is actually a bit of a number, but it's also not entirely crazy. So the difference here is, considering Jotunn's Wrath passive, actually acceptable in my opinion. And Hydra's Lament is the last one in the list with 1115 damage. It's another 16 damage less. So what does that tell us? Well, first of all, in the case of Hydras, we have to keep in mind that this is assuming 2 basics. If it was 3 basics and the Hydra's passive was factored in, then Hydras would already overtake Jotunn's Wrath because it would get an extra 39 damage. If it was 4 hits and all that get the passive, you could basically win the competition with Hydras here. But at the same time, that's a bit unlikely, that's a bit situational. It assumes that your enemy is not juking any of the basics, you land every basic in every single cancel 100%, and also you get the activation for every single ability, which is no longer the case. Even Susanoo doesn't get that anymore. So 3 would be the absolute maximum in my opinion in any realistic scenario, and for that we will not get the damage higher than that of Heartseeker, which means that Hydra's Lament is just not there for the highest damage, but it has other purposes. Hydras is good for 2 other things. It has cooldown reduction, so those gods who require cooldown reduction or benefit strongly from it will benefit from this item, giving it an extra bit of competition against other items. And also it has added MP5, and this MP5 is very, very potent, and those gods who can make use of it can benefit strongly from this. It just allows you to stay out of base much longer if that's what you require to do. It is important to say though that this is not as crucial as it was anymore. It was especially important for Eveline before, but now that she has less mana problems, it's not the biggest issue. Though it's still a good item for those mana hungry characters, and it still overall does the job and it gets enough damage through even next to the others. Combined with a cheap price, that is absolutely fine. Jotunn's Wrath kinda falls in the same category. The benefit here is flat mana instead, but it's still a lot of extra mana. And also, this item gives you the most cooldown reduction of the bunch. So if your character is highly cooldown reduction dependent, then Jotunn's Wrath is still a very solid choice. Especially on gods like Eveline and Hunbats, I still think this is a very good secondary option if you're already building Hydras, for example, or even a primary choice depending on your playstyle. So I would not undervalue this item. Cooldown reduction is just not as equally important for every single god. For example, a Thor will make massive use out of it, while other gods may not benefit as much compared to having extra damage. That brings us to the items with extra damage, like Brawlers and Heartseeker. In the case of Brawlers, the situation is very clear. You want to have this item when there's sufficient healing on the enemy team. Now, Bracer is no longer strong and it will hardly ever be built, so that kinda takes away a decent amount of the benefit that this item had, because that is one of the main reasons why it was built so much so early. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still plenty of healers in the meta and healing items that will still be countered by Brawlers. So if you think you will see any of those, or if you're seeing an enemy with those healing capabilities, then Brawlers is still great for that, and it gives you the highest damage right off the bat. Heartseeker has another benefit, and that is movement speed. And movement speed is an incredibly valuable stat early on. It gives you so much extra rotational speed across the map, it gives you better ways to juke in fights, and it gives you better chase potential. And all of these together are very, very strong, especially for a jungler in early game. So that kinda explains why the item is a little more expensive compared to the slightly lower damage value. It wouldn't necessarily be my primary choice on gods that make good use of cooldown reduction items, so for most assassins I think this is not the primary choice still, but for certain gods it's very, very good. One of them would be Kali, who just benefits from it by having the potential to proc it more than once through a very fast basic attack chain. Another one would be Odin, who simply benefits from the fact that it is instant damage in combination with his 2 and 1, so he has this instant high amount of burst. It's not so much about how much damage he can deal in total that way, but rather that he gets one damage spike in which he blows almost all of his kit, but if the enemy doesn't react in time, then it's basically blown up just through the Heartseeker. What can definitely be said is that through these different effects, all items have a use. All items have a reason to be built. They are so close in price and in damage values that the benefit is usually more in the item-specific passive and effect than the damage values itself, and with Heartseeker being buffed is kind of up there again between the others and fits in a little bit better. So as such, I think if it wasn't for the warrior, jungle meta and the defensive items, those choices would actually, for the first time in a long time, be perfectly balanced against each other, with the decision mostly coming down to what you prefer, what you need to use against the enemy, who you need to counter, and your playstyle. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this gave you some extra insight and some extra info on the topic. If you're not subscribed yet, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth out.